Although Waterloo, New York is officially recognized as having celebrated the first Memorial Day in 1866, it has well over 20 rivals for the title, and all of them, even Waterloo, rely on evidence that at least is somewhat sketchy. For example, Boalsburg, Pennsylvania cites an 1864 gathering of women to mourn the deaths of soldiers killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. Carbondale, Illinois claims 2 markers in its cemeteries, as well as a parade led by Major General John A. Logan, more on him in a moment, as proof that it held the first annual celebration. There are towns named Columbus in Georgia and in Mississippi with competing claims. Clearly, the holiday's long evolution makes it unclear where exactly it began or how it began. But there are 2 unambiguous facts about Memorial Day. One is that we know the forerunner to Memorial Day. And second, we know that southern states dial back their observance of Memorial Day. As I will point out in this video, these 2 facts are tightly linked. Hi, my name is Dennis Richkovsky, and I am a real estate broker, a longtime North Carolina resident, and business owner in Emerald Island, North Carolina, with a passion for all things involving the Crystal Coast. But I was born and raised in New Jersey, where we took our Memorial Day commemoration quite seriously. We had a parade down Main Street, a parade filled with marching bands and marching military. The sidewalks were lined with spectators who followed the fire engines to the cemetery to hear speeches honoring those men and women who died defending our country. Then we listened to the Indianapolis 500. We had never heard of NASCAR, while we ate hamburgers and hot dogs off the grill. When I came south to attend Duke University, I discovered to my surprise that Memorial Day is a rather insignificant event here in North Carolina, and for that matter, all over the South. Search for Memorial Day events, and short of the NASCAR Cup Series Coca-Cola 600, even Google comes up empty. And why is that? Well, it all starts with that darn Major General Logan I mentioned briefly above. You see, he was the head of an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic, a group composed exclusively of Union Civil War veterans. Major Logan and his group found themselves attending increasing numbers of ceremonies all over the North, venerating fallen Union soldiers during and after the Civil War. And finally, in 1868, tired of all that travel, Logan proposed May 30th to be Decoration Day, a day set aside for covering the graves of fallen Union soldiers with flowers. The date was chosen, the story goes, because May 30th is a day on which no Civil War battles were fought and plenty of flowers would be in bloom. On that first Decoration Day, the future president, Union General James Garfield, made a speech at Arlington Cemetery, which held the remains of Union soldiers, and which was situated on land the United States government seized from General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army. You see where this is going. Afterwards, some 5,000 spectators decorated the graves of 20,000 Union Civil War soldiers buried there. Indeed, it was not until after 1900, when Congress authorized it, that Confederate war dead were reinterred in what is now called Section 16 of Arlington National Cemetery. In 1888, Decoration Day became a federal holiday. But back then, holidays applied only to the small number of government employees in Washington, D.C. And so, while Decoration Day was not an official national holiday, by 1890 it had become a state holiday observed by each and every northern state. Southern states, however, continued to ignore Decoration Day and continued to recognize and embrace separate Confederate days of remembrance until after World War I. Indeed, several southern states continued to honor the Confederate dead with their own holiday. January 19th in Texas, April 22nd in Alabama and Georgia, April 26th in Florida, April 29th in Mississippi, May 10th in South Carolina, and June 3rd in Louisiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. It amazes me to see how many people choose to live in the past in this country. As the United States moved on from its Civil War to participate in other armed conflicts, particularly World War I, the meaning of Decoration Day also broadened to include honoring all soldiers who died in the line of duty. By the end of World War II, Decoration Day had morphed into Memorial Day in the minds of many. And in 1968, a law made the name change official. It also moved the newly christened Memorial Day to its modern date, the last Monday of May. This law, called the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, came into effect in 1971 and created the annual Memorial Day weekends that Americans know and love today. But it also angered many Americans who were uncomfortable with the shift in focus from remembrance to enjoying time off. While the states eventually fell in line, many veteran groups continued to voice dissent on this issue. My mother, however, blamed me for the shift from remembrance to enjoying time off. You see, in 1970, I entered a peace float in my town's Memorial Day parade. All I wanted to do was keep from feeding more troops into that meat grinder otherwise known as the Vietnam War. My goal was to reduce the number of soldiers dying in rice paddies and maybe, just maybe, making Memorial Day less about the dead and more about the living. My float did garner attention, some good and some bad. And whether by coincidence or by correlation, future parades in my hometown were greatly scaled back. Regardless of the reason, Memorial Day 2023 will occur on Monday, May 29th. Some large cities like New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., and many small towns across the United States, with the notable exception of the South, will host solemn Memorial Day parades filled with military pageantry and members of veterans groups. In addition to parades, many Americans will also take the time to visit cemeteries and memorials. Some people will wear a red poppy in remembrance of those who have fallen in war, a tradition that began with a poem written by John McCrae about the Second Battle of Ypres during World War I. The poem is called In Flanders Fields, and in it, McCrae channels the voices of the fallen soldiers buried under those hardy red flowers. But you won't experience many solemn Memorial Day events or parades here in North Carolina or anywhere along the Crystal Coast this year. And it all goes back to that darn General Logan and his group of Union Civil War veterans and the subsequent morphing of the Union-inspired Decoration Day into Memorial Day. Here, Memorial Day mostly has evolved into that long kind of 3 or even 4 day weekend that Americans have come to enjoy. A weekend filled with people shopping or getting out of Dodge to visit the Crystal Coast and my flip-flops, donuts, and bagel shop in Emerald Isle, or throwing parties and barbecues. Here in the South, Memorial Day weekend, that long weekend comprising that Saturday and Sunday before Memorial Day and Memorial Day itself, really is all about heralding the beginning of summer. And maybe, just maybe, if we can figure out how to stay out of future armed conflict, Memorial Day itself can morph into Get Ready for Summer Day. And no disrespect to our fallen soldiers, but that may not be such a bad idea.